Good morning, everybody. It's good to see you. I have with me here, and my name is Tom Greaves. I have a consulting business that's focused on the U.S. K through 12 industry. And I have with us here David Engle, who is the superintendent in Nebraska, North Platte. David and I are both on the Project Inkwell steering committee. And we also have David Achim, and David is the CEO of SkyFiber. And we're going to talk today about the U.S. education system, Project Inkwell, and where it might be headed. In the past several days, we've been listening to a number of great challenges for the world, for the country, for us, for individuals. And when I listened to all those challenges, I got to thinking, we talked about the solutions, the CTO solution, corporate solutions, government solutions, and one that's kind of been left out is how those might be solved if we just fixed our educational system and we had a lot of smart people. Imagine if Nathan Lewis, who was our speaker on Tuesday night, what if people like him were common instead of rare? First of all, we might not get into these problems, and secondly, if we did get into them, it would be a lot easier to get out of them. So I think that education is a national priority. It's something that we really can't do without. The problem is that education today is facing a perfect storm. The perfect storm has several legs to the pillar. One of them is that the world outside of education is changing about twice the rate, or maybe 4 times the rate of the world inside of education. So they just can't change as fast as corporations, for instance, and as fast as the world brings new products, new revs of products, and so forth. And so they're falling behind. When the national rate of change outside of education was relatively small, then it wasn't that noticeable. But when they're falling behind, when the outside doubles every year and inside goes up by 20%, then it's getting more obvious. The second is that the requirements for accountability are going way up. And so it used to be that it was okay to have dropout factories and have half the kids not graduate from high school. Policy leaders now think that that's no longer a good idea. And the urgency for better schools is increasing, and the pressure is increasing on the superintendents and other leaders. And third, finances have hit the cliff. And for the last 25 years before the last bust, say like from 1975 to 2000, education spending went up about twice the rate of inflation. And since that time, and certainly now, education spending is declining. And there's no indication that it's going to get any better over any near-term period of time. As a matter of fact, the school funding comes a lot from property taxes, and it takes 3 years between when property taxes head down and when housing prices head down and property taxes catch up. So we're in for several more years of schools being underfunded. So how do you solve that perfect storm? There's really only one good way that hasn't been tried before, and that's technology. Now, in 1996, Mark Anderson, being the visionary that he is, wrote a paper about Inkwell, which was a way to provide technology for every student in a beautifully designed package, and a purpose-built computer for every student. That morphed into Project Inkwell in around 2002 or 3, my memory is correct. And for the next several years, Project Inkwell was the leading organization for bringing people together to work on this problem. And it had a tremendous impact on hardware that's out there, software, services, business models, all of those things were impacted. Now, now at this point in time, in '96, a computer for every student was rare indeed. Today, there's probably 1 million kids in schools that have a computer for every kid, and there's probably 2 million or more laptops, and laptops are going to eclipse desktops in schools next year. So part of the problem, though, is that it's not just putting the technology in, it's how it's put in. So a year ago, my partners and I started a large-scale research project called Project Red for Revolutionizing Education, where we studied 1,000 schools to find out what they were doing, what's working, what's not working, and we had 11 dependent variables such as test scores, graduation rates, number of students taking AP courses, disciplinary action rates, teacher attendance rates, a whole bunch of things. We had 20 or so independent variables and or questions, and some of those had 20 or 30 subparts, but things like how often did students do Google searches? How often were the principals trained, and how much training did they have? What is the student-computer ratio? So we could try and figure out, isolate the effects of technology, but also the effects of proper implementation of technology. From those 1,000 schools, we came up with several key findings. Key finding number one is that across the board, students in schools where every student have a computer outperform schools that don't. So 1-to-1 schools outperform 2-to-1, 2-to-1 outperform 3-to-1, 3-to-1 outperform 4-to-1. Now, never before had anybody really asked that kind of a question, and so there's a lot of uncertainty in the school market about what to do because there's not a lot of data. So hopefully this will help people realize that it is a good idea. A second major key finding is that implementation is important. It's not enough just to put in the technology, it's how you put it in. There's no agreement on how you put in. Even the study we've done with Project Red didn't address all the various variables, but it did provide some starting points. But some of the things on how are training the teachers before you, on the technology before you give it to the students, making sure there's enough bandwidth, sending the principals off to a principal academy, transforming what goes on in the classroom from a teacher-led classroom to a student-centered classroom, providing a wide range of digital facilities and so forth. All of those really work together. Third major finding as we look at this is that if you do it right, it doesn't cost money. It maybe there's an initial investment required, but over time, this is much more of an investment than an expense to state governments. A properly implemented 1-to-1 Project Inkwell type solution is revenue positive at the state level. And that was a real shocker to a lot of people. I'll give you an example of some of the statistics that back up some of these things. 1-to-1 schools, 42% of the 1-to-1 schools say that dropouts are dramatically reduced due to technology. Only 4% of other non-1-to-1 schools make that claim. Disciplinary actions, how often you have to go to the principal's office or the police car rolls. 29% of 1-to-1 schools said that those were dramatically reduced versus 8% of non-1-to-1 schools. High-stakes test scores, 25% said that high-stakes test scores went up substantially due to the technology. Only 9% of non-1-to-1 schools did. In the copy machines and cost savings, 25% of the schools said that copy machine costs were substantially reduced in 1-to-1 schools versus 11% of non-1-to-1 schools. Now, copy machine costs about $100,000 a year to a school, not counting the people, just the cost of the paper. They make about 2 million copies. If you can imagine that if every student had a device, and every teacher did, that in a learning management system, that you could make 1 million less copies. It's a lot of trees you'd save, plus a lot of money. We also found that the transformed classes where the student is in charge and personalized learning substantially outperforms non-transformed classes. It can add as much as 20 points to each of those scores that I mentioned earlier. And it's frequency of use that's important. Schools have it, but surprisingly, even though every kid might have a computer, a lot of them aren't using them. So we have now a lot of data that shows how this works, and we believe now that it's time to go to the next step, do some lower large-scale trials and actually collect in the classroom data and school-level data versus survey data to peel this onion back another layer so that we can really set a pattern for how everybody might exploit the use of technology to transform their schools. Kathy Hurley, who was supposed to be on the panel, had a business emergency and is not here. But she left a book outside that's at the registration desk, which is a worldwide study of the use of technology by kindergarten and those age students around the world and how they're using technology. And it's very good reading. Encourage you to take a look at it. She also left us a video that I'd like to play now about what it looks like in a transformed school. And this is a shot at the Bronx Zoo, and I think you might enjoy it.
The idea of complementary learning, the idea that what we learn in school can be augmented or enhanced by things we do out of school, has been around since the 60s. The power of technology is that it makes that dream a reality. We can now actually connect the different sites, the different contexts in which kids learn, whether it's a school classroom, a museum floor, or a library desk.
In the Mobile Guides summer camp, the students created these interactive guides using the Bronx Zoo. The students were broken into teams of about 4 or 5. And what they did is, in collaborating together and working together, they decided on a theme. And based on that, they did their research. And what they did is they used the Nokia device to take pictures and such to build out this interactive tour.
Okay, so who's next?
What the closest thing?
Yeah, the closest
We're going to the Baboon Reserve. We could put video in the virtual map. We could put text, pictures, describe what we saw. Thank you. You've been a lot of help.
Oh, I'm glad.
You get a better understanding from your point of view instead of trying to figure it out from another person's point of view. So it's more of a hands-on thing. Like you're right there in the moment. You're the one doing it. You're the one taking the pictures. You're the one doing the research. Everything's up to you.
One of the things that I tried to put into this curriculum was something that we're starting to call geoliteracy, and that's sort of a set of things that understands how information is presented on a map, number one, like how information can be aggregated in a geographic way to make different sense than it might if it's only presented like, sort of like as a single video on YouTube.
Right now we took the pictures over here and of the line, so it's been tagged with our phones. So once we go back and we start making our maps, we have the locations of where we need to point out locations and where we took the pictures, and then like have a background information of everything we need.
So day 3 was full throttle production. We had a team that was building out the mind maps. We had a team that was editing video and getting it ready and exported so it can be uploaded into their map. There was a team taking the images and the pictures that they took and getting them into the map as well.
Okay, so right now we're editing the soundtracks for our movie. So right now we're kind of cutting and combining pieces of the soundtracks to make it sound as though everything's combined as one.
Where innovation comes from. Innovation is increasingly a bit of mashing this up and mushing this together and taking this unintended way and putting it with that unintended way and sparking kind of a new reaction that gets other people interested and creates a sort of whole new phenomenon. And I think that that skill and being empowered enough to take A and put it with B and possibly go with Q is a really important skill for the 21st century.
So you can see that school doesn't have to look like the schools that you and I attended. And there's a lot of good characteristics that happened there. We don't have time to go through them. Just wanted to get you a little idea of what could be. I'd like to turn now to David Engle, my most famous superintendent, and he's going to give you the view of what's actually happening. He's actually doing this rather than studying it or talking about it.
Thank you, Tom. I'm reminded that I have the best job in the world, and it's because I get to work with students like that every day if I choose to. The frustrating part of my work is working with the adults. And that's especially true, and we just distributed over 1,000 netbooks this year to students, and the teachers were telling me, boy, I don't know if we can trust the kids, and the only device that was broken by a teacher. So the kids said, oh no, we'd never let these things out of our hands and we wouldn't break them. So we've really learned a lot about putting the tools in the students' hands. One of the things as I was listening to you, that came to mind is the schools that really get it right with these digital tools are the schools where they orchestrate kind of across the board in a comprehensive way the implementation of technology. And I've tried to learn those lessons from Inkwell and from watching other schools go through this evolution, that we're really mindful of how important that orchestration is. And I'll give you a good example of that. Working with my school board this year, I said we need to have strategic goals that kind of match with where we're trying to go as a district in terms of our technology. And so they said, well, what do you want us to say? And I said, I want you to say something about instructional quality first, and then I want you to say something about technology integration. And every other goal needs to kind of flow from that. And so they set a goal to improve instruction so that every student in every classroom in our district is engaged and challenged in their coursework, no matter what it is, math, science, reading, writing. And so when I go into classrooms, I look for engagement and challenge. And what I find is the classrooms where we've done a good job of integrating technology or devices into the students' hands, that you have automatically engagement, automatically. And then the good teachers, the teachers that are really kind of using these tools well, know what challenge looks like in terms of that. So they have interesting projects in front of their kids. They have taken the state standards and embedded them in projects that really make sense, that drive the kids to think deeply, to work together, to kind of model the skills we call 21st century skills. I remind my teachers that we're already 10 years into the 21st century, or 11 if you're, depending on how you're counting. So we got to quit using that term. It's like, at what point do you give up noticing today? So a lot of work around that, those areas. The issues that have come to mind, my dad used to say, have you thought of the consequences of being successful? And usually my answer was no. In this case I have, and one of the consequences of being successful now in my district, where we created a one-to-one environment in a school that was in a needs improvement status with AYP, and now is out of that, has come out of that status almost like a rocket because of the technology implementation, is students are now asking me that we would like to have access to this stuff anytime. And I said, well, you've got connections at home, and what I'm finding out is about half of my students don't have a connection at home. It's interesting when you talk to kids what you find out. So I asked some of my students, what do you mean? Your parents sent in, they checked off that you have broadband access. Well, yeah, but I have 3 brothers and sisters, and I'm the youngest. So I never get on the computer, you know. I thought, oh, okay, interesting problem. And then most, half of my families, just because of poverty, don't have access, don't have broadband access. So one of the ideas that I've been looking at, and David's going to speak to, is how do we get broadband access for every student in America? Because I think beyond kind of broadband as an economic enabler, I think if we can get it to be an educational enabler, you have no idea the power of that. Students see themselves working in a very different kind of temporal state than we do. Their time to them is, they will use these tools to do schoolwork when they're ready, or when they have an idea, or when they're curious. And if I know my kids, I know that's any time. Now they should be sleeping part of that time, but I'd like to know that my students are out there, that they have access to learning all the time, because I think then we can really develop the super learners we need to solve the problems we've created. So that broadband access, that last mile problem, is not trivial, and I think it's something we really need to look at as Project Inkwell goes forward. And then finally, the thing that I found most powerful in my work is bringing the adults on board by creating digital learning environments in their classrooms where the students start teaching the adults. And the most amazing thing is watching kindergartners and first graders show their teachers how to use technologies like smartboards. The kids just have this kind of native sense of curiosity and exploration where they'll just go up and interact with these devices. And the teachers are kind of hesitant. There's that gap, you know, between them and the technology. And the students lead the way in these environments. And it's a powerful shift in how teachers see their roles. And as they shift gears and become facilitators and enablers and supporters, the learning just takes off. It's really incredible to watch. Tom was asking me how my test scores were, and I said, we don't even look at that kind of those low-level standards anymore, because our kids are moving so far beyond that. We have the school I was referring to that was on AYP. persistently low-achieving school list has 100% of its kids at standard in reading and writing, and we don't even consider that important now. It's an achievement that we needed to do, but I want my kids to be able to read way beyond the standard, and they are. So that's kind of where I'm at right now, is the notion of orchestrating a broad, comprehensive approach to this, and I'm getting better at it. Every iteration, I think I know a little bit more and can do a better job with this. But I wanted David to talk a little bit about the whole question of the last mile and how we can to get to that place.
Sure. So, we think of these things in two categories. One is a policy impact in terms of what are we convincing our leadership to do and support. And the second is technologically, how do we innovate and drive the economics down to such a point that you can actually make broadband affordable across the country. And it's not a all or one solution. It's not pull fiber everywhere, because that's not affordable. And Verizon and AT&T aren't going to pull fiber to the Bronx. They're just not going to do it. There's no business model that supports that. So how do we create and how do we innovate to drive some of these things? And one of the things that we think of from a technology standpoint, our company was recently involved in a successful pilot in rural Arkansas. We took a central office location, one point of presence. We dropped 3 of our Skylink optical wireless broadband connections in 3 diagonal areas out, and put some WiMAX Alvarian radios on the end of it. And we were able to blanket an entire area of Cabot, Arkansas, 26,000 people, and they all had mobile broadband at 100 megabits. And this all cost less than $75,000. So, if you look at the cost of pulling a mile of fiber, it's $75,000, and that's just in one direction to one point. So I think we have to challenge ourselves and challenge our ideas about how do we provide access to these kids, because one of our major premises is that if you're not going to connect the unconnected, then we can't compete with other cultures and other societies that are committed to those kinds of connections. And literally, this session is all about, if you're not connected, you can't compete. And that's going to be the challenge for us. And as we go forward now to the policy side of this thing, I'm a little bit irked, just because I've watched over the last 2 years our governments play a little bit of kabuki theater around what are we doing for our people, right? And so you get the whole, I was in the EU at the Milan conference last year, looking at the EU version of the stimulus plan over there, and they had 400 submissions for major proposals for underwriting broadband throughout Europe. And of the 438 proposals, 30 of them got accepted. So, and if you look at our situation, since the BTOP and the stimulus plan was here, over 4,000 applications, 400 were actually dropped into consideration, and 40 of those are going to end up with money. So what that says is, it's kind of like, it gets us all distracted around the wrong things, right? It's like somebody saying in a big room, hey, free beer, kegger over here, and everybody stops doing what they're doing. They rush over trying to get free beer, and everybody's gathered around that, and then but when everybody doesn't get any beer, they get disappointed, right? So now they're back to, oh, we didn't get any free beer. Well, stop thinking about getting free beer and stop working about how to innovate and how to do something creative in your environment is really what we need, is the message we need to send forth to our leadership. And so I'm a huge fan of Edwin Friedman's book, A Failure of Nerve, Leadership in the Age of the Quick Fix. I recommend it highly to all of you. Just a phenomenal book that talks about how we as leaders need to challenge and continue to challenge ourselves, and we lead by example in the presence of what we choose to go do. And that's why I'm a big supporter of FiRe, because I think leadership in this context is what we need to do. So it's got policy implications, but it's also got technology and innovation application, and we got to mix the two together, or we'll have no chance of really solving this kind of a problem.
Commenting on both of your comments, the bandwidth issue is a real issue. We studied that a year or two ago, and it turns out that the average kid today has, on average in school, if you divide the size of the pipe going in by the number of students, about 8 kilobits per second. That isn't a lot. So I go home, I have 8 megabits a second, or 1,000 times more. And Larry Smart here is laughing because he has 8 gigabits a second. So Larry has about 1 million times more bandwidth than the average K-12 US student. And part of the problem that we've got here is that you can't solve the educational system until you move from print to digital. And you can't move it to digital unless you've got the connectivity everywhere. So things like technologies like WiMAX that Cameron mentioned earlier getting 4G services ubiquitous are really important to schools, but there's no leadership, no funding mechanisms to cause that to happen. And David, somebody said that this is the first generation where kids know more than their parents, and the parents find that the kids have valuable information. Up to previous generations, the kids didn't know anything the parents wanted to know. But that's actually obviously changed quite a bit. I'd like to talk a second about the National Ed Tech Plan. The new administration has put out a pretty fantastic technology plan for education compared to previous versions. And it has the concept in it at the end of grand challenges. How many of you are familiar with the DARPA-type grand challenges? Anybody? Several. So one of the grand challenges is to devise a way so that students can learn at twice the rate that they're currently learning at half the cost. If you did that one thing, you would fix the U.S. economic problem and obviously prepare us for competition throughout the world. The other flip side of that is if some other country figures that out before we do, then there may be no recovery. As I was listening to the presentations over the last many years of FiRe, it's pretty obvious that people in this room, once you say David and David, they have the skills and in many cases the technology to cause this to happen. So I'd encourage you to figure out how to go after this. Is a very large market. If you solve that problem, it's a multi-double-digit billion-dollar business opportunity for somebody. I'd like to stop with our talk and see if the audience has any questions. If you do, feel free to jump up to the microphone and one of the three of us will answer it, or we'll get back to you.
Hi, I'm TA from GIST. I'm interested in the last statistic that you talked about around costs, because I think most of us, as far as deploying technology into schools, maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, because most people's assumptions are that it is this big, huge upfront expense, et cetera, as well as for people who are activists within their schools or their school districts. I live in Seattle. How we can use data like that to convince either at the local, meaning one school, district level, or otherwise to do a better job of deploying technology.
Okay. On the cost issue, and David, feel free to chime in, but to provide everything most people would want to have, a computer for every kid connected to a cloud computing system with all the courseware and everything like that, is probably less than $700 per kid per year. Meanwhile, we're spending around $7,000 to $10,000 per kid per year. A lot of those costs, though, are offsettable by other things. So if you did it right and you re-engineered along with putting in the technology, the re-engineering savings exceed the technology savings. David, you want to speak to the second half?
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to approach this, and cannibalism is one of them. What I tell people is we need to offset costs. So a challenge to publishers is let's look at provisioning education differently than the textbook model. Believe it or not, people are still spending a lot of money on textbooks, which kids will tell you. I asked high school students, what's the efficiency of a textbook? And they said, well, if it's 10%, you're lucky. Thinking, well, that's a great waste of money. So in my district, I've declared a moratorium on textbook adoptions. We will look high and low to find a way to augment what's going on in the classroom differently, provision differently. So that's important there. Also, looking into the grant sources for Title I, special education, there's a lot of funding streams that allow you to use that money for different types of provisioning in the school system. And I would encourage you in your conversations with school leaders to look at kind of those other streams, revenue streams differently to provide for digital learning environments. And we've had no problem shifting our budget so that we can afford a very aggressive technology initiative in our district, because I'm pretty agnostic about those particular streams of money and resources. But there is a challenge we need to put out to publishers to get off the textbook treadmill. We've got to look at provisioning schools differently.
Yeah, the only other thing I would say, and add to that, and time is short, but you know, I think we subsidize a whole lot of stuff in this country that doesn't drive a whole lot of value. But I don't know why we can't extend some tax credits or some incentive programs to small operators and ISPs to connect the unconnected, especially in urban areas or other areas where typically other providers just aren't going to go in to do that. So that takes real leadership and real strength of character to go in and promote those kinds of things and put those things on the table in order to really make an effort for this to be real and not just more lip service that we're doing a lot for our kids. And I think that's one of the things that we can, from a policy standpoint, actually go do it and help.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank our panel for what they've done. And we will, you're real practitioners, and we'll be around to talk to you. Thank you. Mark, did you have...